What if I told you that one of the most underrated things about a superhero show could actually help you fall asleep faster? Stay with me here, because I know that sounds completely bizarre, but by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why Invincible Season 3 might just be the most accidentally perfect sleep companion you never knew you needed. And yes, we are going to go deep on some genuinely fascinating facts about this show that most fans have completely overlooked. So grab your pillow, get comfortable, and let us dive into something a little different tonight. Invincible has been one of the most talked about animated shows on Amazon Prime Video for the past few years now, and Season 3 took everything up several notches. But here is the thing that most people miss when they are watching it in the middle of the day, stressed out, fully caffeinated, and paying attention to every single brutal fight scene. The show has layers. Deep, slow-burning, emotionally complex layers that actually work really well as background audio or as a wind-down watch if you approach it the right way. And tonight, we are going to explore some of the most interesting facts, story details, and production elements from Season 3 that make it genuinely fascinating, whether you are wide awake or slowly drifting off into sleep. Let us start with something that a lot of people do not fully appreciate about Invincible as a whole, and that is just how methodically the world building has been constructed. Season 3 did not just happen. The creative team behind this show spent an enormous amount of time building towards specific payoffs that were seeded way back in Season 1. When you are watching Season 3 and things feel like they are finally clicking into place, that is not an accident. That is intentional, layered storytelling that rewards patience. And there is something genuinely soothing about knowing that when you revisit this season, every small detail you might have missed is going to reveal itself to you like a puzzle piece finding its spot. The voice cast in Season 3 continued to be one of the most impressive assemblies of talent in animated television. Steven Yeun brings Mark Grayson to life with this quiet intensity that actually has a really calming quality to it during the slower scenes. His voice carries this kind of tired determination, and honestly, there is something very relatable about that energy, especially late at night. When Mark is processing the weight of being invincible, of carrying responsibilities that feel impossible, his conversations have this hushed, exhausted quality that does not demand your full alertness. It meets you where you are. And speaking of voice performances, J.K. Simmons' Omni-Man is just extraordinary in this season. Without giving away every detail, the dynamic between Nolan and Mark in Season 3 reaches emotional depths that the earlier seasons were building toward. What is interesting is that Simmons brings this low, measured, almost contemplative quality to Nolan in the quieter moments. The character has evolved significantly from a shocking figure we met in Season 1, and that evolution is reflected in the way his voice has softened in certain scenes. There is a gravity to his presence that, in the right setting, feels almost like hearing a very complicated bedtime story being told by someone who has lived through extraordinary things. Now let us talk about something that is genuinely fascinating from a production standpoint. The animation style in Season 3 made some deliberate choices that set it apart from other animated shows in its genre. The color palette in certain sequences was adjusted to be more muted and atmospheric, particularly during scenes that deal with grief, memory, or quiet moments between characters. This was not just an aesthetic decision. It was a narrative one. When the visuals slow down and the colors become more subdued, the show is communicating something to you emotionally, and that communication happens even when you are not fully focused on the screen. There is a certain rhythm to how Invincible tells its story that becomes almost meditative when you know what to listen for. The show alternates between periods of intense action and these really long stretches of character conversation and emotional processing. And it is actually those quieter stretches that make up a significant portion of Season 3. Characters sitting with their feelings. Characters talking through impossible choices. Characters being human, or whatever version of human they can manage to be, given everything they have experienced. Those stretches are genuinely calming to listen to. One of the most interesting facts about Season 3 is how it handled the theme of identity under pressure. Mark Grayson spends a huge portion of this season wrestling with who he is supposed to be versus who he actually wants to be. And that is a theme that resonates on a really deep level because most of us have felt some version of that tension in our own lives. We have all felt the weight of expectations that do not quite fit who we are. Listening to Mark navigate that, even half asleep, can feel surprisingly therapeutic. The show is essentially walking you through a very long, very dramatic therapy session with a superhero. The writing team for Season 3 drew heavily from the source material, Robert Kirkman's comic book series, but they also made some really thoughtful adaptations that changed certain storylines to work better for television. One of the interesting choices they made was to slow down some of the more emotionally significant moments and give them more room to breathe than the comics did. In a comic, you might get a few panels for a conversation that matters. In the show, that same conversation might stretch over several minutes, with long pauses, careful expressions, and music that fills the space between words. Those extended emotional moments are exactly the kind of thing that works beautifully as sleep audio. Let us talk about the music for a minute, because the score for Invincible Season 3 is genuinely underappreciated. The composers working on this show understand that a superhero story is only as powerful as its quieter moments, and the music they wrote for those moments is really something. There are pieces in the score that are built around slow string arrangements and gentle piano figures that would not feel out of place in a meditation playlist. The contrast between the intense action music and the softer, more reflective pieces is one of the things that gives the show its emotional texture, and it is also one of the reasons that certain episodes feel genuinely relaxing to revisit after you have seen them for the first time. The show does something really clever with its pacing that I want to highlight because it is relevant to why it works so well as a wind-down experience. Invincible Season 3 tends to open its episodes with something intense or confrontational, but then it spends the majority of the episode processing the aftermath of that intensity. So if you are using the show as a sleep companion, you might experience a little bit of adrenaline at the start of an episode and then gradually descend into a much calmer, more reflective space as the episode progresses. That is actually a pretty good structure for winding down. Your body gets a small signal that something is happening, and then it slowly relaxes as the episode settles into its emotional core. One of the facts about this season that not everyone picked up on is how much attention was paid to the small, domestic moments between characters. Mark and Amber, Mark and his mom Debbie, Mark and his friends. These relationship scenes are written with a specificity and warmth that feels very grounded compared to the cosmic scale of the action sequences. And when you are trying to fall asleep, those grounded, human moments are the ones that your brain can hold onto without getting overstimulated. They are familiar. They feel like something you might actually experience. And that familiarity is comforting. Debbie Grayson, voiced by Sandra Oh in a performance that honestly deserves more conversation than it gets, has a significant storyline in Season 3 that deals with grief and rebuilding. Sandra Oh has this extraordinary ability to convey enormous emotional weight with very little, and there are moments in this season where you could close your eyes and just listen to her voice working through something complicated and feel genuinely moved. That kind of performance does not require your full visual attention. It communicates completely through sound, which makes it perfect for the kind of half-awake, drifting state that comes just before sleep. Now, something that is really interesting about the world of Invincible that Season 3 expanded on significantly is the concept of the Global Defense Agency and the various organizations trying to manage superhero activity on Earth. These scenes, which deal with bureaucracy, strategy, and long-term planning, are honestly some of the most gently stimulating content in the show. They are interesting enough to give your brain something to process, but not so intense that they keep you fully alert. Cecil Stedman, voiced by Walton Goggins with this wonderfully dry and measured delivery, is particularly good in these scenes. His voice has an almost hypnotic quality in the right context. Let us talk about something that goes a little deeper into why narrative content works so well for sleep. There is actual science behind the idea that story listening can help you fall asleep. When your brain is engaged with a narrative, it has something to focus on that is not your anxiety, not your to-do list, not the thoughts that tend to spiral when you are lying in the dark. The narrative gives your mind a gentle track to follow, and as you get more tired, your grip on that track loosens naturally, and you drift off. Invincible works particularly well for this because the story is complex enough to be interesting but familiar enough, once you have watched it, that nothing is going to genuinely surprise or alarm you. And that brings up another really interesting point about Season 3 specifically. If you are using it as sleep content, there is a real advantage to having already watched it once. Because then you know where the intense moments are, you know the emotional beats, and you can relax into the story rather than feeling any tension about what might happen next. The familiarity acts like a comfort blanket. You are not watching to find out what happens. You are watching to spend time in a world you already know. The character of Adam Eve had some really beautiful moments in Season 3 that are worth highlighting, both because they are genuinely great storytelling and because they have this quality of calm introspection that serves the sleep-watching experience well. Adam Eve has always been one of the most thoughtfully written characters in the show, and the writers in Season 3 continued to give her storylines that deal with purpose, self-worth, and what it means to use your gifts responsibly. These are big themes handled with a quiet seriousness that does not demand heightened attention. You can absorb them passively and still feel like you got something meaningful out of them. One thing that surprised a lot of viewers about Season 3 was how much humor it managed to incorporate without undermining its more serious emotional content. The show has always had this darkly comedic streak running through it, but Season 3 found a slightly gentler version of that humor in certain scenes. There are moments that are just genuinely warm and funny, moments between friends or family that feel light and easy and remind you that even in a show about existential threats and impossible violence, there is room for people to just be people. Those moments of levity are really important for the sleep-watching experience because they release tension without creating more of it. The relationship between Mark and his brother Oliver is something that Season 3 developed in really interesting ways. Oliver, who is half alien and aging at a different rate than a normal human, is at an interesting stage in his development during the season. Watching an older sibling figure out how to guide a younger one through a complicated world is one of those universal human experiences, even when both siblings can fly and one of them is aging at an accelerated rate. That dynamic, played out in quiet conversations and shared moments, has a tenderness to it that is genuinely calming. Another production fact that not enough people talk about is the level of detail that goes into the background design of Invincible. The world that the animators have created is incredibly rich, full of little details that reward close attention but also create a sense of fullness and depth that registers even when you are not actively looking for them. This matters for the sleep experience because a richly detailed world feels safe and complete in a way that a sparse or incomplete one does not. Your subconscious picks up on those signals even when you are not consciously processing them. Let us spend a moment on the cosmic elements of Season 3, because this is where the show does something genuinely interesting from a sleep science perspective. The sequences that deal with the larger universe, with alien civilizations, space travel, and the vast scale of cosmic conflict, have this interesting quality of making human concerns feel very small. And there is actually something quite relaxing about that perspective shift. When the show pulls back to the scale of galaxies and civilizations, your own worries start to feel proportionally tiny. It is a kind of accidental mindfulness, this reminder that the universe is enormous and most of our daily stresses are infinitesimally small by comparison. The Viltrumite mythology that Season 3 explored in greater depth is also fascinating from a pure storytelling perspective. Learning more about the culture, the history, and the internal conflicts of the Viltrumite race adds this epic, almost mythological quality to the show that is really engaging without being stressful. It is the kind of lore that you can sink into, like the appendices of a fantasy novel, and just let your mind wander through it without needing to hold onto every detail. Now, there is something I want to address directly, which is the violence question. Invincible is known for being quite graphic in its depictions of violence, and that is definitely something to be aware of if you are planning to use any version of this show as sleep content. Season 3 does have some intense action sequences. However, and this is really important, those sequences are actually not as frequent as the show's reputation might suggest. The show earns its brutal moments precisely because they are surrounded by long stretches of much quieter content. And if you know the episode structure, you can generally anticipate when those moments are coming and adjust accordingly. The fact that the show takes consequences seriously is actually one of the things that makes its quieter moments so effective. When characters are dealing with the aftermath of something terrible, when they are sitting with grief or confusion or guilt, Those scenes have real weight because the show has done the work of making the events that cause those feelings feel genuinely significant. That emotional seriousness translates into a kind of gravitas in the dialogue that is really conducive to a calm, reflective headspace. Let us talk about some of the thematic content in Season 3 that is particularly relevant to a sleep and rest context. The season deals significantly with exhaustion. Not just physical exhaustion, though there is plenty of that given that Mark is constantly fighting, but emotional and existential exhaustion. The weight of carrying the world on your shoulders. The toll of constantly being needed. The difficulty of finding rest when there is always something else to handle. These themes are ones that a lot of people watching late at night can connect with deeply, because that is exactly how modern life feels for a lot of us. And there is something validating about watching a character as powerful as Mark Grayson struggle with the same fundamental human need to just stop for a moment. The show also deals with the theme of trust in really interesting ways during Season 3. Characters are constantly navigating who they can rely on, who has betrayed them, and how to rebuild relationships after significant damage has been done. These trust narratives unfold slowly and carefully, in long conversations and quiet moments of decision-making, and they have this patient quality that rewards passive listening. You do not need to be fully alert to follow the emotional logic of these scenes. It is intuitive and human in a way that bypasses the need for active cognitive engagement. One of the most genuinely interesting facts about the production of Season 3 is how the creative team approached the challenge of escalating stakes without losing the emotional intimacy that made the earlier seasons so compelling. A lot of shows struggle with this as they progress. The bigger the threats get, the harder it is to make the audience care about the individual characters at the center of the story. Invincible Season 3 managed to avoid this trap by consistently returning to the small, personal scale even in the middle of enormous cosmic conflict. That grounding in the personal is exactly what gives the show its warmth, and warmth is one of the most important qualities in any content you are using to help yourself sleep. Something that the animation team did really beautifully in Season 3 was their handling of light. The lighting in this show is more sophisticated than most animated series, and the choices they made about how to light different types of scenes are worth noting. Scenes that take place at night, indoors, or in reflective, emotional contexts tend to be lit with warm, amber tones that are genuinely visually comfortable to look at. If you are watching in a darkened room while trying to wind down, those lighting choices work with your body's natural relaxation response rather than against it. The show also did something interesting with silence in Season 3. There are moments where the score drops out completely and you are left with just ambient sound and voices. In a genre that often fills every moment with music, that choice to let silence do some of the work is both artistically confident and genuinely calming for the listener. Those quiet moments land differently when there is real silence around them. From a character psychology perspective, one of the most interesting threads in Season 3 is the continued exploration of how early trauma shapes behavior in ways that persist long after the traumatic event. Multiple characters in this season are dealing with things that happened to them years ago, things that have never quite healed, that keep affecting their decisions and relationships. The show treats these psychological realities with a seriousness and nuance that is fairly rare in superhero storytelling. And that depth makes the character work feel genuinely meaningful rather than just plot mechanics. Cecil Stedman's role in Season 3 expanded in ways that were genuinely surprising and which revealed new dimensions of his character that had been hinted at but never fully explored. Without getting into specific spoilers, the show gave Cecil some moments of genuine vulnerability that made him considerably more sympathetic than he had been in previous seasons. Watching a character you thought you had figured out reveal unexpected depth is one of the small pleasures of long-form storytelling, and experiencing it in a relaxed, sleepy state can actually make it hit harder emotionally. Let us also appreciate for a moment how Season 3 handled its ensemble cast. One of the challenges of a show with as many characters as Invincible is making sure that secondary characters feel like real people rather than just plot devices. Season 3 did a particularly good job of giving characters who might have been background figures in earlier seasons their own specific voices and emotional realities. The world feels populated with actual people, which is one of the things that makes it so easy to sink into. The relationship between Mark and his father Nolan continued to be one of the most emotionally complex and carefully written relationships in the show. What is interesting about how this relationship is developed in Season 3 is the way it mirrors a kind of universal process of coming to understand a parent as a flawed and complicated human being rather than the simplified figure they were in childhood. That process, of reconciling love with disappointment, of holding complexity without resolving it neatly, is something that has enormous emotional resonance. And in the quiet moments where that reconciliation is happening between the characters, there is a depth of feeling that works its way into you even when you are half asleep. Now I want to circle back to something I mentioned earlier about the science of story listening for sleep, because I think it deserves a bit more attention. Research into bedtime story listening and audio-based relaxation has consistently found that narrative content, particularly familiar narrative content with a calm and measured pace, is effective at reducing anxiety and promoting the kind of mental quieting that precedes sleep. The reason is partly to do with the brain's response to story structure. When your brain is following a narrative, it is engaged in a way that is active but not alarming. It is processing information, making predictions, feeling things, but none of it requires the fight or flight response that keeps you awake. Invincible Season 3 hits a lot of the markers for effective sleep narrative content in its quieter stretches. Familiar characters whose voices you recognize. Emotional stakes that are real but not personally threatening. A world that is fully realized and therefore safe to inhabit mentally. Music that complements rather than overwhelms. Pacing that slows and deepens as episodes progress. These are not accidents of storytelling. They are the results of craft, and they happen to align beautifully with what the brain needs to move towards sleep. One last production detail that I want to share because I find it genuinely wonderful is the fact that the voice recording sessions for Invincible are apparently done with a real attention to the emotional texture of each scene rather than just technical delivery. The performances you hear are not just competent voice acting. They are genuine emotional performances that happen to be animated. And that comes through in the quality of the sound. You can hear it in the breathing, in the pauses, in the way a voice shifts when a character is holding something back. That level of authenticity in vocal performance is part of what makes the show so good to listen to even without watching. As we wind down this video, I want to leave you with a thought about why something like Invincible Season 3 works as a sleep companion when you would not necessarily expect it to. The answer, I think, is that really good storytelling has always been tied to rest. Humans told each other stories at night, around fires, before sleep, as a way of processing the day, making meaning, and easing the transition into the vulnerability of unconsciousness. The stories did not have to be gentle or simple. They had to be good. They had to hold attention just enough, move the emotions enough, and then release you into the darkness. Invincible Season 3, particularly in its quieter and more reflective stretches, does exactly that. It gives your mind something worth following. It takes your feelings somewhere real. And then, gradually, as the episode settles into its slower rhythms and the characters sit with their complicated feelings in animated rooms lit with warm amber light, it lets you go. It does not demand that you stay. It just keeps talking, keeps being itself, and somewhere in the middle of all that complicated, beautiful storytelling, you drift off. And honestly, there are worse things to drift off to than a story about someone trying to figure out who they are, what they owe the world, and whether it is possible to be good in circumstances that make goodness extraordinarily difficult. So tonight, if you are struggling to sleep, consider putting on an episode of Invincible Season 3. Not the action-heavy ones if you can help it, though honestly even those settle eventually. Put on one of the quieter, character-driven episodes. Turn the brightness down a little. Close your eyes or let your gaze go soft. Let the voices of these characters, these exhausted, complicated, trying their best characters, carry you somewhere. You might be surprised how quickly you find yourself at the edge of sleep, balanced right there on the threshold, with a story still unfolding softly around you. Thank you so much for spending this time here with me tonight. If this kind of video resonates with you, if you like the idea of exploring interesting facts about shows and stories in a way that is designed to help you relax and wind down, then please hit subscribe and let me know in the comments what show or story you would like to explore next. I read every single comment, and your suggestions genuinely shape what I make. Sleep well. Take care of yourselves. And remember that rest is not a luxury. It is the foundation of everything else. Good night. 50 beings. Each one thousands of years old. Each one strong enough to crack a planet. And one of them spent 20 years pretending to be your friendly neighborhood superhero. Let that settle over you as you close your eyes tonight. Invincible is an animated superhero series based on the comic books created by Robert Kirkman, the same person who brought us The Walking Dead. The show is incredibly detailed, layered with emotional storytelling, complex characters, and a universe that feels genuinely vast and alive. Tonight we are going to wander through some of the most interesting facts and details about the show, particularly around the storylines involving the Viltrumite civilization, the characters who carry this story, and the emotional weight that makes this show so much more than just a superhero action series. Let's begin with the world itself. The Viltrumites are an ancient alien civilization, incredibly powerful beings who have spent thousands of years conquering planets across the galaxy. What makes them fascinating is that they don't just conquer in the traditional sense. Their ultimate goal is something more calculated, more patient. They seek to blend their genetics with other species, to rebuild and strengthen their race, which over time had become dangerously small in number. Despite their immense power, there are only about 50 true Viltrumites left alive in the entire known universe. Think about that for a moment. 50 individuals, each one capable of leveling cities, each one living for thousands of years, and all of them working toward a singular purpose that has been ingrained in them since birth. Nolan Grayson, also known as Omni-Man, is one of those Viltrumites. He came to Earth roughly 20 years before the events of the show's main timeline, and his mission was to assess whether humans and Viltrumites could successfully interbreed. He wasn't just a scout. He was part of a long-term plan, an advance wave designed to prepare a planet for full Viltrumite colonization. He built a life here. He married a woman named Debbie, had a son named Mark, became the world's greatest superhero in the eyes of humanity, and spent 2 decades slowly becoming something he was never supposed to become. He became a person who actually loved his life on Earth. Now, here's the part that's so quietly heartbreaking if you really sit with it. When Nolan first arrived, he was hoping his son Mark would not develop Viltrumite powers. That might seem strange at first. Why would a Viltrumite not want his child to be powerful? The answer tells you everything about the complexity of this character. If Mark never developed powers, it would suggest that humans and Viltrumites couldn't successfully interbreed, and the Empire might have just moved on, told Nolan to abandon Earth and try another planet. But if Mark did develop powers, that was a signal. A signal that the experiment worked, that Earth was viable, and that the rest of the Viltrumite Empire would eventually show up to begin the colonization process in full. So when Mark did develop his powers at 17, Nolan knew that everything was going to change. The countdown had begun. And yet, rather than embracing that outcome, something in him pulled in a different direction entirely. He had been living as a human in many important ways. He had loved Debbie. He had watched Mark grow up. He had built friendships, routines, a quiet life alongside all the heroics. 1,000 years of following orders, of being a perfect soldier for the Empire. And it was 20 years on a small planet with a human woman and their half-human son that had finally started to crack something open in him. Mark himself, whose superhero name is Invincible, is the emotional center of the entire series. He's a teenager when his powers first manifest, and like any kid that age, he's figuring out who he is while also suddenly being able to fly and punch through walls. The show does something really thoughtful with his character. It lets him make mistakes. It lets him be wrong about things. It gives him a moral journey that doesn't arrive at clean answers quickly. One of the recurring tensions in his story is figuring out when it's okay to kill, when violence is justified, and where the line is between being a hero and being something darker. By the time the Viltrumite War storyline begins to unfold, Mark has been through an enormous amount. He's faced enemies that nearly killed him, lost people he cared about, and had to reconcile the fact that his father, the man he idolized, was not the hero he thought he was. The emotional fallout from learning the truth about Omni-Man reshapes Mark's entire worldview, and it takes seasons for that wound to even begin to close. Let's talk about Debbie for a moment, because she is genuinely one of the most important characters in the show, arguably more so than even the comics gave her credit for. In the source material she appears throughout, but the animated series really digs into who she is as a person. She's not just a supporting character in her husband and son story. She's a fully realized human being dealing with a betrayal that most people couldn't even begin to comprehend. Imagine finding out that the person you loved for over 2 decades, the father of your child, was not who you thought he was at all. That everything you built together had a shadow underneath it the whole time. And yet, there's something remarkable about Debbie. She keeps going. She rebuilds herself. She finds new relationships, new purpose. And according to the lore of the show, she is quietly one of the most important figures in the entire Invincible universe. Why? Because of how she raised Mark. There are alternate universe versions of Mark Grayson scattered throughout the multiverse, and in almost every single one of them, that version of Mark ended up becoming something terrible. Conquering worlds, following in his father's Viltrumite footsteps. The one version who turned out good, the version we follow, is the one raised by this particular Debbie in this particular universe. She made him who he is. That's not a small detail. That's everything. Now let's drift a little deeper into the supporting cast, because Invincible has one of the richest ensemble casts in any animated series. Alan the alien is a wonderful character, an alien from a species called the Unopans who was originally bred as a champion fighter. He becomes one of Mark's closest friends and a key member of the Coalition of Planets, a group dedicated to resisting Viltrumite domination across the galaxy. Alan is funny, warm, surprisingly wise, and his friendship with Mark feels genuinely earned over time. He also has a pet that is described as cat-like, which is exactly the kind of small, humanizing detail this show sprinkles throughout to remind you that even in the middle of galactic war, characters have ordinary moments of joy. Oliver, Mark's younger half-brother, is another fascinating piece of this universe. His mother was from a species called the Thraxans, and Oliver grows at an accelerated rate, aging physically much faster than a human child would. He has complicated feelings about Omni-Man, their shared father, and a fierce desire to prove himself that sometimes overrides his better judgment. He's brave sometimes to the point of recklessness, and watching him navigate his own relationship with Nolan is one of the quieter emotional threads running through the Viltrumite War storyline. Tech Jacket in the animated series is a character named Zoe Thompson, a young woman whose powered suit gives her abilities to match some of the strongest fighters in the universe. The suit's artificial intelligence is a companion and guide in battle, and her father is portrayed as a warm and supportive presence, deliberately contrasting with the complicated father-son dynamics that run throughout the rest of the show. She joins the Coalition team heading into the Viltrumite War, and her resourcefulness in impossible situations makes her a standout character. Conquest is the kind of villain who stays with you. An elder Viltrumite of immense power and cruelty, he views combat not as a necessary means to an end, but as something to be savored. His fight with Mark is one of the most brutal and emotionally costly battles in the entire series. By the time of their rematch, Mark has grown significantly as a fighter, but Conquest is no less dangerous. The fight is vicious, prolonged, and ugly in the way that only truly high-stakes combat can be. Mark barely survives. His injuries are catastrophic. But he wins, decisively and permanently this time, and the victory costs him nearly everything. What makes that fight resonate so deeply is what it represents within Mark's moral journey. Earlier in the series, Mark struggled enormously with the idea of killing. There was a version of him that wanted to believe there was always another way, that heroes didn't have to cross that line. But the show is honest about the fact that sometimes, facing a being like Conquest, hesitation is not mercy, it's just a slower kind of failure. By the time of their rematch, Mark has arrived at a place where he can make that choice, can carry it, can live with it. That's not portrayed as a victory in itself. It's portrayed as a weight he's chosen to carry, and the show treats that distinction with real care. The Viltrumite War itself is not a single battle. It's a campaign, a a series of conflicts that will unfold across a significant stretch of the story. The coalition of planets, led by a character named Thetis, has been preparing for this confrontation for a long time, and even with their best fighters assembled, the raw power difference between them and the Viltrumites is enormous. Remember that these 50 remaining Viltrumites have conquered hundreds of worlds. They don't fight alone either. They have armies of beings from those conquered races fighting alongside them, worlds that serve out of fear or obligation rather than any loyalty. There's also the matter of a traitor, a mole within the coalition, which creates a tension of mistrust running underneath all the preparations for war. Who is it? What have they given away? How much does the Viltrumite Empire already know? These questions don't resolve quickly, and they color every planning session, every strategic decision the coalition makes. Cecil Stedman, the director of the Global Defense Agency here on Earth, is one of the show's most complex non-powered figures. He's not a hero in any conventional sense. He's a pragmatist, someone who believes the world is best protected through intelligence, contingency plans, and occasionally ruthless decisions made in the shadows. He monitors Omni-Man's return to Earth with careful attention, aware of the Viltrumite war beginning to take shape but seemingly calculating that the coalition might handle it before it becomes Earth's problem directly. Cecil knows about things he doesn't always share, and Mark's relationship with him is one of the most fraught and interesting dynamics in the show. Eve, whose superhero name is Adam Eve, is one of the most powerful beings on the planet, with the ability to reshape matter at a molecular level. She and Mark are deeply in love, and their relationship is one of the genuine emotional anchors of the series. As the Viltrumite War begins, Eve is dealing with a pregnancy, something she hasn't yet told Mark about. Her powers are unreliable because of the pregnancy, which keeps her from being able to join the fight. She makes the deliberate choice not to tell Mark before he leaves for the war, not wanting to distract him with news that could make him reckless or pull his focus at the worst possible moment. It's a decision made out of love, but it creates a painful gap between them, especially given how long Mark winds up being unable to return due to his injuries. The relationship between Mark and Eve is one of the few places in the show where warmth and safety live, and every threat to that connection hits the audience hard precisely because of how carefully the show has built it. Robot and Monster Girl are another fascinating thread in this universe. The two of them ended up trapped in an alternate dimension, and their story there plays out like something from a classic science fiction adventure. Entire civilizations, strange physics, years passing for them while only a fraction of that time passes in the main world. Their return to the main timeline, when it eventually comes, is going to bring its own complicated emotional reckoning. Battle Beast is a character who deserves his own quiet moment of appreciation. He is an alien warrior who lives only for combat, seeking opponents worthy of his abilities. He is not subtle. He is not political. He fights because fighting is the truest expression of who he is. But there's something almost honorable about his simplicity, and when he eventually joins the Coalition's efforts against the Viltrumites, his presence tips balances in ways that matter. Let's come back to Nolan one more time, because there's something worth sitting with about his 1,000 years of life. Imagine living that long, most of it in service to an empire, following orders, conquering planets, living as a soldier rather than as a person. He didn't even know what he was missing until he had it. Until Debbie. Until Mark. Until the ordinary quiet of a life lived for its own sake rather than for an empire's agenda. And then having to stand in front of the person he loved most and try to explain all of it, knowing that no explanation makes it okay, that words don't have the weight to carry that kind of apology. He makes the attempt anyway. He tells her that those 20 years with her were the most real years of his entire 1,000-year existence. That he is going to spend the rest of his life trying to make things right, knowing that he may never fully succeed. She doesn't let him off the hook. She shouldn't. But the attempt itself, the vulnerability of it coming from someone who spent centuries as an unstoppable warrior, is one of the quietest and most human moments in the whole show. There's a dinner scene before Mark and the others leave for the Viltrumite War where they eat Korean food, a reflection of Debbie's heritage. It's one of those details that feels small on the surface but carries a lot of meaning. This family, fractured and complicated and hurting in all kinds of ways, still sitting down to share a meal together, still finding those ordinary rituals of connection even at the edge of something enormous and frightening. That's what Invincible does better than almost anything else in the superhero genre. It remembers that the people behind the powers are still people. Art, the tailor who has made suits for Omni-Man over the years, has a brief but emotionally heavy scene when Nolan comes to say goodbye and finds that their friendship, like so much else, has been irreparably changed by everything that came to light. Art tells him not to come back, that their time is done. And then, after Nolan leaves, he breaks down. Not from fear, though some of that is there, but from grief. For the friendship they had, for the version of Nolan he thought he knew, for the loss of something that had mattered to him deeply. It's a small scene in the context of everything else happening, but it lands. As the Viltrumite War begins in earnest, as the Coalition's team moves into the conflict, as battles are fought and terrible prices are paid, the show keeps returning to these intimate human moments. That balance is what makes the larger conflicts feel meaningful rather than just spectacular. You care about the outcome because you care about the people caught up in it, and you care about them because the show has taken the time, consistently and carefully, to show you who they really are. The Viltrumite War is a long conflict. It will not resolve quickly. There will be losses, reversals, moments of impossible courage, and moments where the scale of what they're facing feels truly overwhelming. But there's also going to be growth in it. Oliver finding his footing. Nolan discovering what kind of father he can still be. Mark healing, literally and in every other sense, from wounds that go far deeper than the physical ones. And somewhere back on Earth, Eve is waiting, carrying a secret, her powers still uncertain, her heart split between worry and hope. Robot and Monster Girl are somewhere in between dimensions, living out a whole other kind of story. Cecil is watching his screens, calculating, always calculating. And the 50 most powerful beings in the known universe are moving through the galaxy with patient certainty, because they have been doing this for thousands of years and they don't expect this particular resistance to be any different from all the others. But this resistance has something the others didn't. It is people who have genuinely chosen to fight, not out of conquest or fear or imperial programming, but because they love something, love people, love a life worth protecting. That's what Invincible, at its core, is really about. Not powers or battles or even survival. It's about what you choose to fight for, and whether who you love can make you into something better than what you were before you found them. So let that settle in as you drift off tonight. The universe is impossibly vast, full of ancient civilizations and galactic conflicts and beings who have lived for 1,000 years. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a half-human kid from a suburb on Earth is choosing, again and again, to be the version of himself his mother raised him to be. Sleep well. Robert Kirkman built one universe where civilization collapses, and another where a teenage boy discovers his father has been lying to the entire human race. Settle in, because the second one is far stranger than the first. Invincible is an animated superhero series streaming on Amazon Prime Video, and it is based on a comic book series created by Robert Kirkman. If that name sounds familiar to you, it should, because Robert Kirkman is also the mind behind The Walking Dead. He has a real gift for taking familiar genre concepts and twisting them in unexpected directions, adding moral complexity and emotional weight that you just do not find in more traditional superhero stories. Invincible is very much a product of that same sensibility. On the surface, it looks like a colorful animated superhero show, but underneath it is dealing with themes of identity, legacy, trauma, and what it actually means to be good in a universe that does not always reward good behavior. The show follows a teenager named Mark Grayson, who goes by the superhero name Invincible. Mark lives in a world where superheroes are real and relatively common, but his situation is particularly unique because his father, Nolan Grayson, is Omni-Man, one of the most powerful beings on the planet. Nolan is essentially the Superman figure of this universe, beloved by humanity, respected by governments, trusted by everyone. And for most of his childhood, Mark grew up proud to be his son, proud to eventually develop his own powers, and excited to follow in his father's footsteps as a protector of Earth. The show does something genuinely interesting with this father and son dynamic. It builds up that sense of admiration and connection between Mark and his father for long enough that you feel it too as a viewer. You understand why Mark idolizes him. And then when the show reveals that Nolan has been hiding a much darker purpose all along, it lands with real emotional impact. Nolan is not actually from a peaceful civilization. He is a Viltrumite, a member of an extremely powerful warrior race whose true goal is galactic conquest, not protection. The Viltrumite civilization is one of the most compelling elements of the entire Invincible story. These are beings of extraordinary physical power, capable of surviving in space, flying at tremendous speeds, healing from almost any injury, and living for thousands of years. Some Viltrumites in the story are tens of thousands of years old. One character named Argol is noted to have been around 12,000 years before the events of the story, and he would have lived considerably longer if circumstances had not cut his life short. For Viltrumites, a human lifetime is barely a blip on the timeline. 1,000 years is something they can wait through with patience, treating it as a minor inconvenience rather than an eternity. This longevity is part of what makes the Viltrumite threat so difficult to deal with. They are not in a rush. They can afford to play long games, to plan across centuries, to let things develop slowly in their favor. And this is central to one of the most significant storylines in the show, which involves something called the Great Resurgence. The Great Resurgence is essentially a grand plan for cultural and biological survival. After a devastating conflict reduces the number of pure Viltrumites to a very small group, the remaining warriors are ordered to spread out across Earth, integrate themselves into human society, have children, and rebuild their population from within. The idea is that Viltrumite genetics are so dominant that even half Viltrumite children will carry the strength, speed, and longevity of their Viltrumite parent. Over generations, this would gradually increase the number of Viltrumite-capable beings in the galaxy without requiring a direct military campaign. The number of Viltrumites involved in this plan is specifically confirmed to be 37. 37 individuals scattered across an entire planet, doing their best to blend in with the billions of humans around them. And remarkably, they do a very good job of it. Even sophisticated surveillance systems fail to detect them initially. They take on ordinary lives, ordinary routines, and ordinary social interactions, which for beings who are used to being conquerors and warriors is quite the adjustment. One of the more quietly amusing aspects of this storyline is how differently each Viltrumite handles the task of assimilation. Some take to it more naturally than others. One character named General Craig seems to adapt almost immediately, throwing himself into human life with genuine enthusiasm. He picks up human habits, finds enjoyment in simple pleasures, and shows every sign of someone who has no interest in ever returning to a life of conquest. It is a surprisingly human response from a character who was previously defined entirely by military ferocity. Meanwhile, the character of Anissa faces her own version of this adjustment. Anissa is a Viltrumite warrior who in her natural state is someone you absolutely do not want to encounter on a bad day. The idea of her being instructed to be pleasant, sociable, and non-threatening to the humans around her is inherently loaded with tension. And the show uses that tension well, showing us just how much discipline it takes for someone like her to operate within these new expectations. The architect of all this is Thrag, who holds the title of Grand Regent of the Viltrumite people. This is the highest position among his civilization, and it comes with a very specific mandate. Thrag's primary responsibility, above everything else, is ensuring the survival of the Viltrumite species. That is his purpose, his identity, and the lens through which he views every single decision he makes. When he tells Mark that his role is to guarantee the continuation of his people, he is not speaking dramatically for effect. He genuinely means it in the most literal sense possible. Everything he does traces back to that mission. This creates an interesting dynamic with Mark, whose role becomes increasingly complicated as the show progresses. Mark is half Viltrumite himself, the son of Nolan, and therefore carries that same genetic heritage. Thrag at one point refers to Mark as a kind of Viltrumite savior, someone who whether he likes it or not has become central to the survival and continuation of his father's people. This is not a position Mark sought out or is comfortable with, but it is the reality he finds himself in. Mark's struggles in the show are not just external conflicts with powerful enemies. A significant portion of what makes his character compelling is the internal battle he wages with his own anxiety and trauma. As the story progresses through its later seasons, Mark begins experiencing vivid and disturbing hallucinations, particularly around the presence of Thrag. These are not simple nightmares he can shake off in the morning. They bleed into his waking life, into conversations with people he loves, into ordinary moments that suddenly become terrifying. He watches people around him be destroyed in his imagination while trying to hold a normal conversation with them. This psychological deterioration is handled with real care in the show. It does not just exist as a dramatic device. It reflects something true about what happens to a person who has been through sustained trauma and who is carrying the weight of decisions that affect billions of lives. Mark is a teenager, essentially, who has been thrust into circumstances that would be difficult for seasoned veterans to navigate, let alone someone still figuring out who he is. His relationship with Eve, known more formally as Atom Eve, is one of the emotional anchors of the series. Eve has her own remarkable powers, centered around the manipulation of matter, and she has her own complicated history that informs who she becomes throughout the story. Her family background gave her a difficult foundation, full of dysfunction and pressure, and those early experiences echo through the choices she makes as an adult, particularly in some of the more emotionally heavy storylines the show takes on. Eve's powers are connected in interesting ways to her physical and emotional state. During a period when she is going through significant personal changes, her abilities fluctuate in ways that reflect what is happening inside her. This is treated as more than just a plot mechanic. It is a way of showing how deeply her inner world and her outer capabilities are connected. When her powers come back in full, it is not arbitrary. There are real reasons rooted in what her body and mind are experiencing. The show also gives considerable attention to the character of Cecil Stedman, the director of a government organization called the GDA, which stands for the Global Defense Agency. Cecil is one of those characters who exists in a morally ambiguous space that the show refuses to resolve into simple good or bad. He cares about protecting humanity, genuinely and deeply. But he is also willing to use methods and make decisions that cross lines most people would consider unacceptable. His relationship with Mark and with Omni-Man is built on mutual suspicion and occasional cooperation, neither side fully trusting the other, both sides needing each other anyway. When Cecil discovers that 37 Viltrumites have been living among the human population without detection, his reaction is one of genuine shock and anger. This is a man whose entire professional identity is built around knowing what threats exist and where they are. The idea that beings of that level of power slipped under his radar entirely, for an extended period, is both humbling and alarming. It forces a recalibration of what he thought he was capable of monitoring. On the cosmic side of things, the show introduces viewers to a much larger universe through storylines involving the Coalition of Planets, a multi-species alliance that exists partly in opposition to Viltrumite expansion. A character named Alan, the alien, plays an increasingly important role in the Coalition's leadership, and his arc involves grappling with enormous moral decisions. At one point, he comes into possession of something called the Scourge virus, a biological weapon specifically engineered to be lethal to Viltrumites. The terrible catch is that because Viltrumite genetics have now mixed with human genetics, using the virus would also threaten billions of innocent people. This is exactly the kind of dilemma that Invincible loves to present. There is no clean answer. Using the virus could solve one problem while creating a catastrophe of entirely different proportions. Not using it leaves a threat in place that has the potential to reshape the future of Earth. Alan, for all that he is now in a position of significant authority, is fundamentally a decent person trying to do the right thing in a situation where right and wrong have become deeply entangled. The show also has a storyline involving two heroes named Robot and Monster Girl, who become trapped in another dimension entirely. This dimension, called the Flexen dimension, has a different relationship with time than the regular universe. Time moves significantly faster there, meaning that while very little time may pass for people in the main world, Robot and Monster Girl are experiencing much longer stretches. The adventures and experiences they accumulate there are extensive, and the process of eventually understanding and communicating what happened to them becomes its own narrative challenge. Efforts by the GDA to open a portal to the Flaxen dimension in order to rescue them prove complicated and occasionally dangerous, as these kinds of interdimensional experiments tend to be. When a portal does open inadvertently to the wrong dimension and something very large and very alarming starts to come through, the decision is made to abandon the active rescue approach and trust that Robot and Monster Girl will find a way back on their own. Nolan Grayson, Mark's father, goes on his own journey of change throughout the series. His path from feared antagonist to something more nuanced is one of the show's longer arcs. He is not simply redeemed in a neat way. The process is slow, contested, and complicated by the fact that the harm he caused cannot be undone. Characters who were hurt by what he did do not simply forgive him because he has started behaving differently. Debbie, Mark's mother, in particular has to work through years of grief, anger, and betrayal before anything resembling reconciliation can even begin to be considered. The truce that eventually forms between Earth and the Viltrumites is not a comfortable peace. It is a negotiated standoff where both sides understand clearly what the other is capable of and neither wants the alternative. Mark agrees to allow the Great Resurgence to proceed, meaning the Viltrumites continue their project of integrating into human society and having children. In exchange, they do not destroy the planet. One of the specific conditions of this arrangement is that the Viltrumites will not intervene to help Earth if other threats arise, which, given how frequently threats arrive in this universe, is not a trivial concession. The show treats this truce with appropriate ambiguity. It is not presented as a victory in any triumphant sense. It is more like Mark looking at the available options and selecting the one that keeps the people he loves alive in the immediate future, while creating a set of complicated long-term consequences that he will have to live with. When Thrag suggests that Mark has become a savior for the Viltrumite people, there is something genuinely uncomfortable about that framing, because Mark has not chosen that role and does not particularly want it. Throughout all of this, the show maintains its interest in the supporting cast and their own individual stories. William, Mark's closest friend, has moments that ground the narrative in something more ordinary and relatable. The contrast between the cosmic scale of what Mark is dealing with and the more personal human concerns of the people around him is something the show handles with skill. Not everyone in Mark's life can fully comprehend the scope of what he is navigating, and that gap creates its own kind of loneliness. The animation style of Invincible is deliberately constructed to lull you into a certain sense of familiarity before it disrupts that comfort. It is bright and detailed, with character designs that feel welcoming and expressive. And then when violence or darkness arrives, which it does in this show, it hits harder because of the contrast. The creative team has spoken about this as an intentional choice rooted in how the original comics worked. The artwork in the comics had a clean, almost cheerful quality that made the darker moments land with more force. Robert Kirkman completed the Invincible comic book series some years before the animated show caught up to those storylines, which means the destination of these characters is already written down somewhere. Readers of the comics know how things ultimately resolve for Mark, for Nolan, for Eve, and for the larger universe they inhabit. But the show adapts and adjusts as it goes, adding new sequences, altering pacing, and occasionally changing the specifics of how events unfold while maintaining the emotional core of what the comics established. The show has been renewed through its 5th season, with discussions about additional seasons likely happening behind the scenes at Amazon. Kirkman himself has expressed a desire to continue the story for as long as the show runs, and there is plenty of source material to draw from. Beyond the main comic series, the Invincible universe includes many spin-off characters and stories that could theoretically be adapted or referenced in the animated show. There is also a long-standing conversation about the possibility of a live-action Invincible film. Kirkman has discussed this at various public events with genuine enthusiasm, though the timeline for such a project remains uncertain. The challenges of bringing Viltrumites and their level of power to live action convincingly are considerable, and the legal and logistical complexity of adapting material of this scale means that patience is probably required for anyone hoping to see it happen. For now, the animated series continues to be one of the most discussed superhero stories currently in production, drawing in audiences who might not have previously read the comics and giving longtime fans a chance to see these characters rendered in motion with full voice performances. So there you have it. The world of Invincible is vast, complicated, morally rich, and endlessly interesting to think about. Whether you are a longtime fan of the comics, someone who discovered the show first, or just someone who wanted something interesting to drift off to tonight, hopefully these facts have given you something worth carrying into your dreams. The universe will keep spinning, the Viltrumites will keep assimilating, and Mark Grayson will keep trying to figure out how to be both a good superhero and a good person at the same time. Sleep well, and we will be here next time with more fascinating facts to help you rest. Robert Kirkman built a universe so detailed that even the corners of it have history, and tonight, those quiet corners are yours to drift through. So let's begin at the beginning. Or rather, before the beginning. Because the world of Invincible, in so many ways, is about what happened long before the story we see on screen or read on the page. It's a universe built on ancient civilizations, on wars that were fought across star systems, on choices made thousands of years ago that ripple forward through time and change everything. And there's something genuinely soothing about that kind of storytelling. The sense that history is long and deep, that no single moment exists in isolation, that everything connects to something older and something still to come. The show Invincible is based on a comic book series created by Robert Kirkman, who is also the person behind The Walking Dead. The Invincible comics ran for many years and built an enormously detailed universe, one that the animated adaptation on Amazon Prime has been carefully and lovingly bringing to life. What makes the show special, among many things, is the way it treats its source material, not as a blueprint to follow rigidly, but as a foundation to build upon. The show expands on scenes that were only briefly mentioned in the comics. It gives new voice and new life to characters who existed mostly in the margins. It fills in gaps that readers might not have even known were there. The main character is Mark Grayson, also known as Invincible. He's a teenager, the son of a man named Nolan Grayson, who most people know as the superhero Omni-Man. Omni-Man is one of the most powerful beings in the universe, a member of a species called the Viltrumites. And the show begins with Mark discovering that he has inherited his father's powers. Flight, incredible speed, strength that can shatter mountains. But the story is not really about those powers. Not at its core. It's about identity and family and the weight of expectation and what it means to do the right thing when the right thing is genuinely difficult to determine. Let your breathing slow down a little. Feel the weight of your body settling into whatever surface you're resting on. Let the muscles in your shoulders release. There's nothing you need to do right now. Just listen. The Viltrumites are central to almost everything that happens in Invincible. They are an ancient race of beings who evolved on a distant planet. Over thousands of years, they developed incredible physical abilities. They became extraordinarily strong and fast, nearly invulnerable, capable of surviving in the vacuum of space, able to travel between star systems through sheer force of will and biology. And as they grew stronger, they also grew more aggressive. Their civilization became defined by conquest. They moved through the universe, taking worlds, absorbing populations, expanding an empire that stretched across vast stretches of space. At the heart of Viltrumite history is a figure called Argol. He was an emperor, the ruler of Viltrum during one of the most significant periods in their history. In the animated series, we get to see flashbacks to this ancient time, something the original comics did not always provide. These scenes show us the Viltrumites at their height, governing conquered worlds, overseeing alien populations, wrestling with questions of how to maintain control. Argol himself is depicted as powerful and commanding, someone accustomed to absolute authority. When subject races rebel against Viltrumite rule, which happens more and more often during this period, Argol's response is extreme and immediate. A percentage of the population is to be killed as a warning. If the rebellion continues, the entire race is eliminated. This is the logic of empire carried to its most brutal conclusion. Sitting in this flashback council is a younger version of Thetis, a Viltrumite who would eventually become one of the most important figures in the fight against Viltrumite expansion. Thetis tries to argue for a different approach. for mercy, for finding solutions that do not involve mass slaughter. And nobody wants to hear it. There is also a much younger version of General Craig, another familiar face from later in the story. And there is Thrag, who at this point in history serves as Argor's regent. That's an important distinction. Thrag is not in line to become emperor. His role as regent is to manage the day-to-day business of governing the empire while Argor rules, and to hold the throne if something happens before an heir can be located. The question of Argor's heirs is one of the more intriguing threads running through this part of the story, and it connects to revelations that are still unfolding. Let your eyes close fully if they haven't already. Picture the darkness of deep space. Not the terrifying emptiness of it, but the quiet, the stillness. Countless stars scattered across an infinite canvas, each one a sun to worlds you'll never see. There is something deeply peaceful about imagining the scale of it. How small our worries become against the backdrop of a universe this old and this vast. Thetis eventually kills Argor. He does it using a weapon made from Viltrumite bone, which is one of the few materials hard enough to pierce Viltrumite skin. This detail is fascinating in the grim way that a lot of Invincible lore is fascinating. The most effective weapon against a Viltrumite is another Viltrumite. The enemy of this species is, in a very literal sense, itself. Thetis believed that killing Argor would change the Viltrumites, that without their emperor driving them toward endless conquest, they might find a different way of being, a more peaceful path. He was wrong. Because Argor's death put Thrag in charge, and Thrag had a very different vision for the future of his people. Argor's casket is placed before the throne. His skull rests on top of it. Thrag sits on the throne and looks at it every day. He speaks to it. In the comics and the show both, this is one of those details that reveals so much about a character without requiring any explanation. Thrag is not simply a conqueror. He is someone for whom the past is always present. Someone who carries grief and obligation like they are the same thing. He declares that all weakness must be purged from the Viltrumite race. What follows is called the Great Purge, and it is exactly what it sounds like. Viltrumites fighting and killing each other in a brutal process of elimination. Only the strongest survive. Half the population is lost. But what remains is something almost impossibly powerful. A race refined to its absolute peak. And that is when they really begin their campaign to conquer the universe. One of the Viltrumites who survives is Conquest. There's a small scene where even after Thrag orders the purging to stop, Conquest does not want to stop. He would have kept going until he was the last one standing. You can almost see him calculating whether he could take Thrag himself. He decides he probably cannot, and stops. That small moment tells you everything about who Conquest is and why he is so dangerous. He is not motivated by ideology or loyalty. He simply wants to fight, wants to win, wants to keep going until there is nothing left to defeat. There is also a young Omni-Man in the crowd during these scenes. Nolan Grayson, Mark's father, present during the Great Purge, alive during this period of Viltrumite history. The show has been slowly filling in pieces of his backstory, helping viewers understand how someone becomes who Omni-Man is. He looks younger here, and one of the interesting things to notice is that Thrag, who is clearly ancient, does not appear to have aged the same way Omni-Man does later. Age affects Viltrumites strangely. As they get older, they slow their aging further. They become functionally immortal at a certain point. But the exact reasons why some of them age in particular ways is tied to genetics and battle history, and things the story is still slowly revealing. Let the weight of your eyelids settle. There's no rush. The story will still be here, moving gently forward, whether you're fully awake or half dreaming. Just let it carry you. After the flashback ends, we return to the present-day story of the show, which takes place on a world called Telescria, the home base of the Coalition of Planets. The Coalition is an alliance formed specifically to oppose the Viltrumite Empire, and it is led by Thetis, the same Thetis who killed Argor thousands of years before. He has spent millennia working against the empire he once served. He has recruited aliens and humans and half Viltrumites and anyone else willing to fight. And now, They face their best opportunity to strike. Thrag and a small number of Viltrumites have retreated to their home planet of Viltrum. The larger Viltrumite forces are scattered across the universe, returning from their various postings and conquests. If the coalition can strike now, before those forces reassemble, they have a chance. Not a great chance, but a chance. Thetis believes that killing Thrag is the key. Without their leader, the Viltrumites will fragment. The unity that makes them so dangerous would collapse, and they could be dealt with one or two at a time. The mathematics of the plan are brutal but straightforward. Find the general, remove the general, watch the army fall into chaos. But Omni-Man has a complication with this plan. Thetis is not interested in making peace with any Viltrumites. His goal is extinction. Every single one of them. And that includes half Viltrumites. Mark and Oliver, Nolan's sons, would both be on that list. So Omni-Man is being asked to fight alongside someone whose ultimate vision of victory involves the death of his own children. That tension runs through everything that follows. Viltrum itself is a haunting place. Surrounding the planet is a ring, not of ice or rock like Saturn, but of bodies. The preserved remains of the Viltrumites who died during the Great Purge, kept in orbit as a permanent monument. Omni-Man explains this to Oliver when they arrive. The ring exists as a reminder of weakness. Every time a Viltrumite left the planet or returned to it, they saw those bodies. A constant lesson. A constant shame. A civilization that had literally turned its own dead into propaganda. The fight at Viltrum is enormous. Multiple simultaneous battles happening across and inside the planet. Thrag at the center of all of it, effortlessly handling challenger after challenger. Omni-Man goes after him. Then Mark. Then Oliver. Battle Beast tries his luck. Space Racer fires his incredibly powerful Infinity Ray at close range. And Thrag is essentially unbothered by all of it. There is a moment where Mark, who recently killed a Viltrumite named Conquest, announces this fact during the battle. And even the Viltrumites fighting all around them pause. Even Anissa, who has been physically dominating Mark throughout this fight, looks at him differently. Even Thrag is genuinely impressed. He invites Mark to hit him at full strength. Mark does. It does not move Thrag even slightly. Not a single hair displaced. The animation of this moment is apparently stunning, using visual techniques that make Thrag look not just powerful but elemental. Like a force of nature that has simply been given a face. Breathe slowly. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands relax open. The story continues at its own gentle pace, and you are exactly where you're supposed to be. The planet Viltrum is ultimately destroyed. The Coalition uses Space Racer's Infinity Ray to bore a tunnel through the planet's core, and then Omni-Man, Mark, and Oliver fly through that tunnel together, pushing the already fractured crust apart, splitting the planet. The imagery is spectacular, apparently. The debris field. The bodies still floating in that original ring of dead. The silence after something that large and that old simply stops existing. Nolan's reasoning for wanting to destroy the planet is almost poetic in its sadness. He sees Viltrum not as a home but as a tomb. A monument to everything wrong with what his people became. While it exists, the Viltrumites can never truly change. So he helps erase it from the universe. Thrag's response to losing his planet is to kill Thetis. He rips his head off with the same calm efficiency with which he does everything. Declares that Argol has been avenged. The man who killed the Emperor has now been killed. The score, in Thrag's mind, is settled. But the war is far from over. He then turns his attention to Omni-Man, nearly kills him, leaves him in a state of serious injury. Oliver gets his hand crushed and his jaw destroyed. Mark is knocked unconscious. Thrag holds Mark's skull for a moment, looking at the destroyed planet. And then, for reasons he does not fully explain, he lets Mark live. He says he does not want to see more Viltrumites die. But the show seems to be suggesting there is another reason. One tied to things not yet revealed. He then orders the surviving Viltrumites to make for Earth. The plan has changed completely. They no longer have a home planet, so they will take one. Earth is now the target. The Viltrumite remnants will conquer it, settle it, use its human population to rebuild their numbers through interbreeding, and begin again. The empire that lost its home will make a new one out of the world Mark has spent his entire life protecting. There is a gap of several weeks in the story after this battle. Time for people to heal. Alan, a character from the Coalition, is named the new leader now that Thetis is gone. Everyone recovers. But no one can find the Viltrumites, because the Viltrumites are already heading to Earth. They are already on their way. And Earth does not know what is coming. Let your mind wander if it wants to. Let it drift toward that image of space again. The quiet between stars. The long, long distances. The way light takes years to travel from one point to another, so that when you look at a star, you are always seeing the past. There is something comforting in that. History is always arriving. Nothing is ever entirely gone. The animated Invincible series does something that a lot of adaptations of comic books fail to do. It remembers that the best superhero stories are not about the action. The action is the surface. Underneath it is something much more intimate. Family. The complicated love between parents and children. The question of what we owe the people who made us. What we do when the people we love are also capable of terrible things. Omni-Man is a perfect example of this. He is genuinely one of the most powerful beings in the universe. And he has spent his life making choices that have caused enormous harm. Coming to Earth on a mission of conquest, spending 20 years building a family, and then being changed by that family in ways he did not anticipate. His love for his wife and his son is real. And his identity as a Viltrumite conqueror is also real. And those two things cannot coexist. And the entire series is about what happens when that contradiction finally breaks open. Mark carries this same contradiction inside him. He is half human and half one of the most feared species in the universe. He wants to be a hero in the straightforward sense, the kind of hero who shows up and saves people and goes home afterward. But the universe keeps demonstrating that heroism is enormously complicated. That saving one person sometimes means failing another. That the right choice is rarely obvious and often comes with costs that nobody tells you about in advance. The show also has a genuinely unusual willingness to sit with difficult emotions. To let its characters be wrong. To let them be scared. To let them fail. There are episodes where Mark does not win. Where the people around him are hurt and he cannot stop it. Where the bad thing happens despite everything he does. And the show does not flinch from the consequences of those moments. They ripple forward. They change people. Let yourself sink a little deeper. The voice continues. The story keeps moving. But you do not need to hold any of it. Just let it float through, soft and unhurried. One of the interesting things the animated series does is give more screen time and depth to characters who existed mostly in the background of the comics. The Coalition of Planets, for example, is a much more fleshed-out organization on the show. The various alien races, their politics, their histories, their reasons for opposing the Viltrumite Empire, all of this gets more room to breathe. Thetis in particular becomes a genuinely complex figure. He is someone who made an enormous sacrifice, killing his own emperor because he believed it was the right thing, and spent thousands of years working toward a goal, only to find that the methods he is willing to use to achieve that goal have made him something not entirely different from what he was fighting against. He would kill every Viltrumite, including the ones who have done nothing wrong, including children. The purity of his original intention has calcified into something that looks a lot like the ruthlessness he once opposed. Robert Kirkman has talked about how Invincible is, in many ways, a story about cycles. About how violence produces more violence. How empires justify their cruelty with the memory of past injustice. How individuals carry the weight of histories they did not personally create. Mark is the person in this story who has the best chance of breaking one of these cycles. He has access to both the human and the Viltrumite parts of the universe. He is loved by people on both sides. He has, potentially, the ability to find a path that nobody else can find. But the story is honest about how difficult that is. How many things stand in the way? How many powerful people have decided that the cycle must continue? The voice acting in the animated series has been widely praised. The cast is genuinely remarkable. Stephen Yeun voices Mark with a kind of earnest energy that makes you root for him even when he is making obvious mistakes. J.K. Simmons voices Omni-Man with a gravitas that makes every scene feel significant. Sandra Oh plays Mark's mother Debbie with real emotional precision. And there are dozens of guest voices throughout the series, including some surprising choices that speak to the passion of the people making it. The connection between Invincible and Transformers, for example, is more than coincidental. Robert Kirkman grew up deeply devoted to Transformers. It was one of the defining pop culture loves of his life. When casting Thetis, he reached out to Peter Cullen, who has voiced Optimus Prime for decades. And when it came time to use the character of Argyle, Kirkman wanted Frank Welker, the voice of Megatron. Getting both of these voices into the same animated universe was clearly deeply meaningful to him. His company Skybound even publishes Transformers comics, completing a circle that started with a kid watching cartoons and grew into someone who got to build universes of his own. Your breathing is slower now. The tension in your body has eased. The day is further away than it was when we started. The thoughts that were loud before are quieter. The story has been doing its work, gently and without hurry, filling the space where anxiety usually lives. The planet Viltrum, before it was destroyed in the show, had orbited its star for longer than human civilization has existed. The ring of dead surrounding it had been there for thousands of years. Thrag had sat on his throne, looking at Argyle's skull, for longer than most of the other characters in the story have been alive. There is something that the show does with time that is unusual for superhero storytelling. It takes the long view. It reminds you that civilizations rise and collapse, that the strongest empires eventually face their reckoning, that the most powerful individual is still finite, still mortal in some sense, still subject to the slow pressure of history. After Viltrum is destroyed and the dust of that enormous battle settles, the story turns toward Earth. This has always been where the story was headed. Earth is where Mark grew up. Earth is where his mother lives. Earth is where everything that made him who he is was built. And now the most dangerous military force in the universe is heading there with nothing left to lose. No home planet. No emperor who values any life but Viltrumite lives. Just the cold logic of conquest, looking for a new world to call its own. The season finale of the 4th season is being set up as an epilogue of sorts, a quieter moment to process the enormous events of the battle at Viltrum before the next wave of chaos arrives. This is a storytelling pattern that works very well. Give the audience the explosive confrontation, and then give them space to breathe. Let the characters sit with what just happened. Let the weight of it settle. Let the audience wonder what comes next without rushing directly into the answer. And there is so much that comes next. The comics continue for a long time after this point in the story. There are secrets still unspoken. There are characters whose full histories have not yet been revealed. There are relationships that will change and break and reform. There are moments of genuine joy alongside the violence. Moments where the show remembers to be funny, to be warm, to celebrate the ordinary human pleasures of eating something good or talking to someone you love or just being alive on a planet that is, for this particular moment, not under attack. The world of Invincible is enormous and detailed and rich. It is a universe that rewards attention but also rewards simply being present with it. You do not have to understand everything. You do not have to track every reference or catch every Easter egg. You can simply let it exist around you, this vast fictional cosmos full of ancient wars and complicated love and the ongoing struggle to figure out what it means to be good when goodness is genuinely hard. So let the story continue in your mind, wherever it goes. Let Viltrum drift apart in the darkness. Let Mark rest while he heals. Let the stars keep their long, slow distances from each other. Let Thrag fly toward Earth through the cold of space, a figure of terrifying power and strange, complicated grief. Let Omni-Man lie somewhere healing, thinking about his sons. Let everything be exactly as complicated and as unresolved as it really is. Because the story is not finished. It will keep going. There is always more to discover. And you can discover all of it another time. Right now, there is only this moment. The quiet. The dark. The weight of everything softening into rest. The universe is very large and very old and very patient. It will still be there when you wake up. All of its questions will still be waiting, gentle and unhurried, exactly where you left them. Sleep now. The story can wait. It has waited thousands of years already. A few more hours is nothing at all. Just let go. Let your thoughts become pictures and your pictures become nothing in particular. Let the voice become a hum. Let the hum become silence. And let the silence be enough. You are safe. You are still. The night is long and soft and exactly as it should be. Rest. The animation team behind Invincible spent years hiding secrets inside a show most people watch through their fingers. So let's slow it all the way down and find every single one of them. Invincible is an animated superhero series that premiered on Amazon Prime Video in March of 2021. It is based on the comic book series created by Robert Kirkman, the same mind behind The Walking Dead. The show follows 17-year-old Mark Grayson, a teenager who is just trying to survive high school while also figuring out that he is slowly developing superpowers. His father, Nolan Grayson, goes by the name Omni-Man, and he is essentially the most powerful superhero on Earth. Think of the strongest, most respected hero you can imagine, and that is Nolan. He has been protecting the planet for years, and Mark just wants to be like him. What makes Invincible so special right from the start is the way it handles expectations. For the first 20 to 25 minutes of the very first episode, it genuinely looks and feels like a typical superhero origin story. The colors are bright, the tone is upbeat, Mark is a lovable, awkward teenager, and everything seems cheerful and optimistic. The creative team behind the show did this intentionally. They wanted the audience to feel completely safe and comfortable before pulling the rug out from under them. That tonal bait and switch is one of the most talked about decisions in the entire first episode, and it works spectacularly. The show is produced by Skybound Entertainment, which is Robert Kirkman's own production company, giving him a level of creative control that a lot of comic creators never get when their work is adapted. Kirkman actually served as an executive producer on the series, meaning he was deeply involved in the decisions being made about how the story would translate from page to screen. That involvement shows in how faithfully the series respects the source material, while also finding smart ways to expand and breathe new life into it. One of the first things you notice about Invincible is its voice cast, and it is genuinely one of the most impressive assembled for any animated project in recent memory. Steven Yeun voices Mark Grayson, bringing this warm, earnest quality to the character that makes you root for him immediately. Steven Yeun is best known for his live-action work, including his role in The Walking Dead and his Oscar-nominated performance in the film Minari. His involvement in Invincible speaks to how seriously the production took the project. This was not a casual animated gig. This was a full commitment to bringing depth and authenticity to the character. Yotka. Simmons voices Omni-Man, and honestly, the casting is so perfect it almost feels like it was inevitable. Simmons has this natural commanding authority in his voice. When Nolan speaks, you listen. There is a weight to every word, a sense that this is a man who has seen and done things that most people cannot comprehend. And as the season progresses and we learn more about who Nolan truly is, that vocal authority takes on a much more unsettling quality. The way Simmons modulates between warm father and terrifying force of nature is genuinely impressive work. Sandra Oh voices Debbie Grayson, Mark's mother, and her performance is quietly one of the most emotionally affecting things about the entire season. Debbie starts out as a fairly typical supportive mother figure, but as the season unfolds and the truth about Nolan begins to surface, Sandra Oh gets to do some extraordinary emotional heavy lifting. The audience feels every crack in Debbie's world through her voice alone, and that is a testament to both the writing and Oh's craft. The show also features J. Robert Oppenheimer. No wait, That is the famous physicist. The show features Zazie Beetz as Amber, Mark's girlfriend, Gillian Jacobs as Adam Eve, Andrew Rannells as William, and an almost absurd number of celebrity cameos and supporting roles that pop up throughout the season. Mark Hamill is in the show. Walton Goggins is in the show. Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg, who are actually two of the showrunners, both provide voices. The sheer density of talent in this cast is something that fans talk about frequently. Now let us talk about the animation itself, because this is something that deserves real appreciation. The show is produced by Skybound Animation in partnership with Amazon Studios, and the animation style is deliberately reminiscent of classic American superhero cartoons from the late 90s and early 2000s. Think of that era of animation where everything had clean lines, expressive faces, and dynamic action sequences. The show channels that nostalgic energy while simultaneously pushing into territory that those older cartoons would never dare to go. The color palette of the show is worth noticing. In quieter, more domestic scenes, the colors are warm and a little soft. There is a comfort to those moments, a visual language that says everything is fine, everything is normal. But when action sequences begin, and especially when violence escalates, the colors become more saturated, more intense. The show uses color as an emotional guide, steering your feelings before the dialogue or action even registers consciously. One of the more interesting technical decisions made by the animation team involves the way blood and injury are depicted. This is a show that does not shy away from the consequences of superhero combat. When people get hurt in Invincible, it looks like it hurts. This was a deliberate creative choice rooted in a specific philosophy. The creators wanted the violence to feel meaningful rather than consequence-free. In most superhero content, characters trade blows without any visible lasting damage, which can make the stakes feel artificial. Invincible refuses to let that happen. The show's first season covers roughly the first 13 issues of the original comic series, though with some adjustments and additions. The pacing is notably different from the comics, with the television adaptation taking time to develop relationships and emotional dynamics that the comics sometimes moved past quickly. This was a smart adaptation choice because television audiences need to feel emotionally connected to characters before those characters are put through difficult situations. By the time the season reaches its pivotal moments, you genuinely care about everyone involved. Let us talk about Adam Eve for a moment, because she is one of the most fascinating characters in the season. Eve Wilkins has the ability to rearrange matter at a molecular level, which makes her arguably one of the most powerful characters in the entire show. She can transform one substance into another, create things from nothing, and theoretically reshape reality itself if she wanted to. But she was raised and trained by a government organization that encouraged her to use her powers in limited, controlled ways. The tension between Eve's extraordinary potential and the constraints placed on her by others is one of the recurring themes of her character arc. What is interesting about Eve is that her power, while incredible, is shown to have real emotional and physical costs. Using her abilities extensively drains her. There is a fatigue that comes with pushing her powers to their limits, and the show portrays this not as a simple weakness but as a reminder that even immense power comes with a price. This humanizes her in ways that make her far more compelling than a character who simply has unlimited capability. The Guardians of the Globe are another element worth exploring. These are Earth's premier superhero team in the Invincible universe, essentially the Justice League equivalent of this world. They are powerful, respected, and seemingly unstoppable. The show introduces them with genuine affection, letting you spend just enough time with them to appreciate their personalities and dynamics. There is Dark Wing, who has an obvious Batman energy. There is Green Ghost, War Woman, Aquarius, Red Rush, and the Immortal leading the team. Each one is distinct enough to feel like a real character rather than just set dressing. The decision to invest even a small amount of time developing the Guardians before the end of the first episode is a masterful storytelling choice. Because what happens to the Guardians in the final act of that first episode lands so much harder when you have already started to feel something for them. The show knew exactly what it was doing, and it executed that setup with precision. Cecil Stedman is a character who deserves a lot of attention. He is voiced by Walton Goggins, and he runs a secret government organization called the Global Defense Agency. Cecil is genuinely one of the most morally complicated characters in the entire season. He is not a villain in the traditional sense, but he is absolutely not a hero either. He operates in a world of hard choices and calculated sacrifices, and he makes those choices with a cool, almost clinical detachment that is deeply unsettling when you think about what it actually means in practice. The interesting thing about Cecil is that nearly everything he does is technically in service of protecting humanity. His motivations are understandable, even sympathetic in the abstract. But the methods he employs and the lengths he is willing to go to are the kinds of things that make you deeply uncomfortable. Walton Goggins brings exactly the right energy to this role, that particular flavor of charming menace that he has deployed to great effect throughout his career. There is a character named the Mauler twins who appear in the season, and they are a fascinating creation. They are clones who have lost track of which of them is the original. Each twin believes himself to be the genuine article and the other to be the copy, but neither can actually prove it, and they have essentially given up trying to resolve the question. What is wonderful about this detail is that it says so much about identity and selfhood in just a few words. The Mauler twins are comic book villains, but that one character detail elevates them into something that touches on genuinely philosophical territory. The show handles the theme of legacy with remarkable sophistication throughout the season. Mark is not just trying to become a superhero. He is trying to become his father. He wants to earn the Omni-Man name, to live up to the standard that his father has set. Almost everything Mark does in the early episodes is filtered through this desire for paternal approval. He trains harder because he wants his dad to be proud. He tries to understand his powers because he wants to share something meaningful with Nolan. That emotional drive is the engine of the entire season. What makes this so effective dramatically is what happens when the object of that admiration is revealed to be something else entirely. When the truth about Nolan begins to emerge, it does not just change how you see Nolan. It recontextualizes every warm father-son moment that came before it. You replay those scenes in your mind and you read them differently. That retroactive reframing is one of the most powerful storytelling techniques available, and Invincible deploys it with devastating effectiveness. The show includes a sequence in episode 4 that is particularly worth mentioning. Without getting too deeply into the specifics, there is a mission involving a group of superpowered teenagers that goes genuinely and horribly wrong. The sequence is difficult to watch and intentionally so. But what is remarkable about it is how the show handles the aftermath. The emotional and psychological consequences of what happens are not swept under the rug. Characters grieve. Characters struggle. The show insists on sitting with the weight of what occurred rather than moving past it quickly. And that commitment to emotional honesty is one of the things that separates Invincible from most superhero content. Teen Team is the junior superhero group that Mark occasionally interacts with, and their dynamic is interesting because it mirrors a lot of typical teenage social structures. There is hierarchy, there is competition, there is the particular awkwardness of young people trying to prove themselves. Atom Eve is part of this group, as is Rex Blode, whose relationship with Eve is one of the season's more grounded and relatable emotional threads. Rex is charming in a frustrating way, the kind of person who is easy to like and easy to be annoyed by simultaneously, and the show uses that quality to great effect. The music in Invincible is something that does not get discussed enough. The score was composed by John Paisano, and it does extraordinary work throughout the season. Paisano understands that music in a show like this needs to serve multiple emotional registers. There are moments when the score needs to swell with genuine heroic energy, and Paisano delivers that. But there are also moments when the music needs to be quietly ominous, threading a sense of unease beneath a scene that looks perfectly ordinary, and Paisano handles those moments with particular skill. The tonal complexity of the score mirrors the tonal complexity of the show itself. Let us take a moment to appreciate the show's approach to world building, because it is genuinely impressive. The Invincible universe is enormous. There are multiple alien civilizations, secret government programs, interdimensional threats, and dozens of established superheroes all coexisting in the same world. And yet the first season never feels overwhelming. The world building is introduced gradually and always in service of the story being told in the moment. You never feel like the show is stopping to explain its mythology. Instead, the mythology emerges naturally through character interactions and plot events. The Viltrumite civilization is the most important piece of world building in the season, and the show is remarkably patient about revealing its full significance. Viltrumites are Nolan's people, a warrior race of near-indestructible beings who have built an empire spanning thousands of worlds. The show drops hints about what this means throughout the season before finally laying out the full picture in the closing episodes. By that point, the implications are staggering, and the audience is fully equipped to understand exactly why what they are learning is so devastating. The relationship between Mark and his best friend William is a lovely thread running through the season. William is not a superhero. He does not know about Mark's powers for most of the season. He is just a regular kid who is trying to figure out his own identity, including his sexuality, which the show addresses with a refreshing matter-of-factness. William's storyline is small compared to the superhero drama happening around it, but it is vital because it keeps Mark grounded in a recognizably human world. Without William, Mark might float away entirely into the superhero narrative and lose some of what makes him relatable. There is a character named Damien Darkblood, a demon detective, who shows up in a handful of episodes investigating the mystery of what happened to the Guardians of the Globe. Darkblood is a fascinating creation, a figure from hell who has chosen to spend his existence solving crimes rather than committing them. He is given almost no backstory, and yet he manages to feel fully realized through a combination of sharp design, economical writing, and excellent voice performance. He is the kind of character who could carry his own series, and his departure from the show's story is handled in a way that is simultaneously satisfying and quietly melancholy. The show's finale is one of the most emotionally intense pieces of superhero storytelling ever put to screen. The confrontation between Mark and Nolan that serves as the season's climax is a long sequence, almost uncomfortably extended, and that length is part of what makes it so effective. This is not a quick, clean resolution. It is a prolonged, brutal reckoning that refuses to give either character or the audience an easy out. The emotional content of that sequence, the love and betrayal and grief and desperation tangled together, is handled with a sophistication that rivals the best dramatic television regardless of genre. J.K. Simmons' vocal performance in that finale sequence is something that people who worked on the show have pointed to as one of the highlights of the entire production. The range he covers, from cold authority to something that sounds disturbingly close to pleading, across the course of that conversation is remarkable. And Stephen Yeun matches him completely, delivering a performance that captures exactly what it feels like to have the person you most admire in the world reveal themselves to be something you cannot reconcile with the image you held of them. The show was renewed for a second and third season before the first season had even finished airing, which speaks to the confidence Amazon had in the property. That confidence was clearly justified given how the show was received by both critics and audiences. The response to Invincible Season 1 was remarkably enthusiastic, with particular praise going to the voice performances, the animation quality, the writing, and the willingness to take the genre seriously rather than treating superhero stories as inherently lightweight material. One of the more interesting behind-the-scenes facts about the production involves the sheer number of episodes that were developed simultaneously. Because Amazon ordered multiple seasons before production was complete, the creative team was able to plan long-term story arcs from very early in the process. This kind of structural freedom is rare in television, and it shows in the writing. The first season plants seeds that will pay off much later, and the team was able to do this knowing that they would actually have the chance to deliver on those promises. The design of Omni-Man's costume is worth a brief appreciation. It is deliberately simple, almost aggressively so compared to the intricate designs of other characters. The black cape, the dark suit, the large mustache that became an internet sensation unto itself. The visual simplicity of Omni-Man's design communicates something important about the character. He does not need elaborate armor or flashy technology. He is the weapon. Everything about him is contained in his physical presence, and the stripped-down costume reflects that. Cecil's scarring, the visible damage to his face, is a visual element that carries significant narrative weight. It represents a story from the past, a consequence of decisions made long before the events of the first season. The show does not rush to explain it. The scars are simply there, a constant physical reminder that this world has a history full of difficult choices and real consequences. That kind of visual storytelling, letting a design element communicate character backstory without explicit exposition, is one of the hallmarks of sophisticated animation. The first season of Invincible also does something interesting with the concept of heroism itself. The Global Defense Agency, Cecil's organization, represents a certain pragmatic approach to protecting humanity. They make deals that are morally uncomfortable. They deploy assets in ways that could be described as using people rather than working with them. Their effectiveness is real, but so is their willingness to compromise on ethical questions when the stakes are high enough. This creates an ongoing tension about what it actually means to protect the world and whether good intentions justify troubling methods. Mark wrestles with this tension throughout the season, and his discomfort with some of what Cecil represents is an important part of his character development. Mark is not naive exactly, but he holds onto an idea of heroism that is fundamentally about doing good rather than just achieving good outcomes. The difference between those two things, and the question of whether that distinction can survive contact with a world full of genuinely terrifying threats, is one of the season's most intellectually interesting questions. There is a lovely detail about the way the show depicts Mark's school life. His high school feels genuinely lived in rather than generic. The social dynamics, the particular rhythms of teenage existence, the way time moves differently at that age, all of it feels observed and authentic. The creative team clearly believed that the superhero elements of the show would only matter as much as the human elements beneath them, and the effort put into the high school setting reflects that belief. Amber as a character gets some criticism from certain viewers who feel she is not developed enough in the first season, and that is a fair observation in some respects. But it is also worth noting that Amber demonstrates a grounded practicality and emotional intelligence that distinguishes her from the typical love interest in this kind of story. She is not waiting to be defined by her relationship with Mark. She has her own values, her own sense of purpose, her own lines she will not cross. Those qualities are established quietly, but they are there if you are paying attention. The show uses a specific narrative technique that might be called delayed revelation, where information is withheld not to manipulate the audience but to replicate the experience of a character who does not yet have access to that information. We learn things when Mark learns them, and we are disoriented when Mark is disoriented. This creates a powerful sense of alignment between the audience and the protagonist that makes every discovery hit with the emotional force of a personal revelation rather than a plot update. There is something worth noting about the show's handling of grief, particularly in the later episodes. When characters experience loss, the show gives that loss room to breathe. There are quiet scenes that exist specifically to let the weight of what has happened settle on both the characters and the audience. This is a discipline that a lot of action-focused storytelling lacks. Invincible understands that audiences need to feel the cost of events before moving on, and it honors that need consistently. The season concludes with Mark fundamentally changed from the person he was in the first episode, but not in a way that feels arbitrary or forced. Every development in his character arc traces back to specific experiences and relationships and choices. His transformation feels earned rather than imposed, which is one of the most important qualities a season of television can have. When you finish watching and you think back to where Mark began, the distance he has traveled is genuinely striking. One final thing worth sitting with as you drift towards sleep is just the broader significance of what Invincible Season 1 accomplished in the landscape of superhero media. It demonstrated that the genre could support genuinely complex, emotionally sophisticated storytelling without sacrificing entertainment value or accessibility. It took the things that make superhero stories compelling and used them as a foundation for something that asked harder questions and demanded more from its audience. And it did all of this while still being completely, thoroughly watchable, the kind of show that pulls you through episode after episode without you quite realizing how much time has passed. The legacy of this first season is a show that earned its place among the most celebrated animated series of its era, not just among superhero content but among ambitious storytelling more broadly. It reminded audiences and creators alike that animation is not a limitation but a possibility space, a medium capable of things that live action cannot always achieve, and that the stories told there can be every bit as affecting and meaningful as anything else on your screen. So as you settle in tonight, let these details and stories drift through your mind. The care taken with every voice performance, the deliberate visual choices, the patience of the storytelling, the richness of the world that Kirkman and the creative team built together, the way a teenage boy trying to be like his father became one of the most resonant origin stories in superhero fiction. All of that is waiting for you to revisit it, to notice new things, to appreciate how much craft went into every single frame of this extraordinary first season. Rest well. The world of Invincible will be there when you wake up. What if I told you that one of the most quietly brilliant things about Invincible Season 2 has absolutely nothing to do with the punching, the blood, or the dimension-hopping chaos that dominates every conversation about the show? What if the most fascinating layer of that season is happening in the background, in the quieter moments, in the scenes that most people scroll past when they're recapping the highlights? Stick around because we are about to go deep into some genuinely mind-blowing facts about Invincible Season 2 that you probably never noticed, and I promise you, by the end of this, you are going to look at that season completely differently. These are the kind of facts that are perfect to have drifting through your mind as you drift off to sleep. So get comfortable, because this is going to be a good one. Let us start at the very beginning of what makes Season 2 so special on a structural level. The showrunners made a deliberate creative decision to slow things down compared to Season 1, and this was not an accident. After a first season that moved at absolute breakneck speed and culminated in one of the most shocking animated moments in recent memory, the creative team behind the show chose to let Season 2 breathe. They wanted the audience to sit with the trauma, to feel the weight of what had happened rather than immediately rushing into the next massive conflict. That decision was controversial for some viewers who wanted the pace to stay relentless, but the more you think about it, the more brilliant it becomes. Great storytelling is not just about what happens. It is about how what has already happened continues to echo through everything that comes after. And speaking of echoes, one of the most interesting things about Season 2 is how deeply it is concerned with the psychological aftermath of violence. Mark Grayson is not just dealing with the fact that his father was the villain all along. He is dealing with the specific horror of having been nearly beaten to death by someone who loved him. That is a very particular kind of trauma, and the writers took real care to show how it changes the way Mark moves through the world. You can see it in the way he hesitates in certain fights, in the way his confidence has this new fragile quality underneath the surface bravado. Season 1 Mark was cocky in a way that felt earned and fun. Season 2 Mark is cocky in a way that sometimes feels like a performance he is putting on for himself as much as anyone else. Now here is something that a lot of casual viewers completely miss. The color palette of Season 2 shifts in subtle but meaningful ways depending on whose emotional state we are tracking in any given scene. The animation team put enormous thought into how light and color could be used to communicate internal experience without any dialogue at all. When Mark is at his most vulnerable, the scenes around him tend to pull toward cooler, more muted tones. When he is at his most powerful or confident, the saturation cranks up and the warm tones come flooding back in. This is not always consistent, and sometimes it shifts mid-scene, which is actually the point. His emotional state is unstable, and the visual language of the show reflects that instability in real time. The relationship between Mark and his mother Debbie is one of the most underappreciated emotional threads in the entire season. Think about what Debbie is going through. She spent years in a loving marriage with a man who turned out to be living a double life of almost incomprehensible brutality. Her whole identity as a wife and as a family unit has been obliterated. And yet she still has to be a mother to a teenager who is also processing this betrayal while simultaneously saving the world on a semi-regular basis. The scenes between Sandra Oh, who voices Debbie, and Stephen Yeun, who voices Mark, have this incredible weight to them. There is so much that both characters want to say and cannot quite find the words for, and that gap between what they want to express and what they actually manage to articulate is where some of the most honest emotional writing in the whole series lives. Here is a fascinating behind-the-scenes fact about the voice cast that most people do not know. The actors in Invincible often record their lines separately, which is completely standard for animation production. But what makes Invincible a little different is that the showrunners and writers have spoken about how certain emotionally pivotal scenes were orchestrated to give the actors as much context as possible before recording, even when they were not in the booth together. The goal was to make the performances feel reactive and lived in rather than isolated. And when you go back and listen to Season 2 with that knowledge in your head, you start to hear things differently. The pauses are more loaded. The breaths before certain lines carry more meaning. It is the kind of craft that does not call attention to itself but that you feel without necessarily being able to name it. Let us talk about Angstrom Levi, because he is one of the most thematically rich villains in the whole show, and Season 2 really leans into what makes him work. What is interesting about Angstrom is that he starts the season as someone you could almost sympathize with. He is not evil in a mustache-twirling way. He has a genuine grievance and a genuine goal. He wants to help people across dimensions, to aggregate knowledge and use it for good. The tragedy of his arc is that the transformation he undergoes, both physically and psychologically, turns all of that altruistic intention into something unrecognizable. He becomes a monster not because he wanted to be one, but because of a sequence of events that he only partly caused and that partly happened to him. That moral ambiguity is so much more interesting than a straightforward bad guy, and it makes the conflict between him and Mark feel genuinely tragic rather than just exciting. One of the things the show does brilliantly in Season 2 is use the concept of parallel universes not just as a plot device but as a genuine philosophical tool. When Angstrom can access countless alternate realities, you start thinking about what that means for identity and choice. Every version of a person that exists across infinite dimensions represents a different set of decisions, a different set of circumstances, a different life. And yet something remains constant at the core. That question of what remains constant, of what is essential about a person no matter what variables change around them, is something the season keeps returning to in different ways. It is not always explicit, but it is always there, running underneath the surface of the action. Now I want to spend some time on something that gets almost no attention in the discourse around this season, and that is the sound design. Invincible has always had extraordinary sound design, but Season 2 takes it to a new level. The way impacts are layered, the way the silence before a major moment of violence is held just a beat too long so that when the hit lands it feels almost physically shocking. These are decisions that take enormous skill and intentionality. The sound team works in close collaboration with the animation team to make sure that what you see and what you hear are creating a unified experience. Some of the most brutal moments in Season 2 hit as hard as they do not just because of how they look, but because of how they sound. The audio is doing as much emotional work as the visuals in many key scenes. Here is something genuinely surprising about the production timeline for Season 2. The gap between Season 1 and Season 2 was significantly longer than most fans expected, and a big part of that was because the team wanted to use the additional time to refine the animation quality beyond what they had been able to achieve in the first season. If you sit down and do a careful comparison between certain scenes from Season 1 and equivalent scenes from Season 2, the difference in fluidity and detail is noticeable. The fight choreography in particular got a significant upgrade. The team spent a lot of time studying real martial arts and physics to make the way these superhuman characters move feel more grounded and believable, even when the things they are doing are completely impossible by the laws of physics as we understand them. The Cecil Stedman storyline in Season 2 is one that rewards really careful attention. Cecil is such a fascinating character because he operates in this completely immoral utilitarian framework where the only thing that matters is outcomes. He is not cruel for the sake of it. He genuinely believes that everything he does is in service of protecting humanity. But the show refuses to simply validate that worldview, and it also refuses to simply condemn it. There is no easy answer to the question Cecil raises, and that discomfort is intentional. When you have a character who does objectively terrible things for arguably defensible reasons, you as the audience are forced to sit with the complexity of it. Season 2 pushes that discomfort further by showing how Cecil's approach creates real consequences for real people, even as it sometimes genuinely works. Something that does not get nearly enough credit is how Season 2 handles the supporting cast. Characters like William, Eve, and Amber all get moments this season that give them genuine depth and agency beyond their relationships with Mark. William in particular goes through something in Season 2 that fundamentally changes how you see him, and the writing around his arc is remarkably thoughtful. The show understands that the world Mark inhabits is full of people who are dealing with extraordinary things in very ordinary ways, and that contrast is part of what gives the emotional moments their power. Not everyone has superpowers. Not everyone can punch their way through their problems. Most of the characters on the show have to find other ways through, and watching them do that is often more compelling than watching Mark punch something very hard. Let us get into some of the more technical and nerdy aspects of the production, because there is genuinely fascinating stuff here. The animation studio behind Invincible uses a combination of digital tools and techniques that allow them to create a visual style that is deliberately reminiscent of the original comic book art. Robert Kirkman's source material has a very specific visual identity, and translating that to animation without losing what made it distinctive was a major creative challenge. The line work in the animated series is not trying to be photorealistic. It has a certain flatness and directness that is very much in conversation with the comics, and yet it also does things that only animation can do. The way characters move, the way the camera operates in action sequences, these are things that simply cannot exist on a comic book page, and the team embraces that rather than fighting against it. The multiverse storyline in Season 2 also allowed the writers to do something really clever from a narrative perspective, which is to show us versions of the story that could have gone differently. When you see alternate versions of characters making different choices or facing different circumstances, it creates this implicit argument that the choices our main characters have made are not inevitable. Things could have gone another way. Mark could have become something else. Nolan could have chosen differently. The fact that they ended up where they did is the result of specific decisions made under specific pressures, and the multiverse framing makes that visible in a way that a more linear narrative structure would not allow. Now here is something I find endlessly interesting about Season 2, which is how it handles the theme of legacy. Mark is fundamentally a character who is trying to figure out what it means to be a hero in the shadow of a father who is definitively not one. Every choice he makes is in some sense a response to Nolan. Every time he could take a shortcut and chooses not to, it is a statement about who he wants to be versus who he was raised by. That is not just compelling drama. It is a really honest engagement with how we all carry our parents with us, how we are shaped by them even when we are actively trying to be different from them, and how that process of differentiation is never as clean or complete as we would like it to be. The Viltrumite Empire as a whole gets more development in Season 2, and what makes them interesting is that they are not just brutes. They have a complex civilization with its own internal logic, its own history, its own sense of honor and hierarchy. Understanding that does not make them less threatening. If anything, it makes them more so, because it means that the conflict is not just a matter of good versus evil. It is a collision of civilizations with genuinely incompatible values, and neither side fully understands the other. That kind of conflict is much harder to resolve than one that is simply about defeating a bad guy, and Season 2 is very aware of that complexity. Let us talk about something that is maybe a little more abstract but that I think is central to why Season 2 resonates the way it does. The season is, at its core, about what it costs to be good. Not just what it costs in terms of physical danger, though there is plenty of that. It is about the emotional cost, the relational cost, the cost to your sense of self. Being a hero in the Invincible universe is not a glamorous or comfortable thing. It is exhausting and thankless, and it puts you in impossible situations where every option has terrible consequences. The show does not romanticize that. It sits with the difficulty of it, and that honesty is part of what makes it feel more real than most superhero content. Here is a detail that I genuinely love, and it is the kind of thing you only catch if you are paying very close attention. Throughout Season 2, there are small visual callbacks to moments from Season 1 that work almost like emotional bookmarks. A character will be in a pose or a lighting setup that echoes an earlier scene, and the resonance between the two moments adds a layer of meaning to the current one that would not be there without that reference. The animators and directors are very deliberate about these moments. They are not accidents or coincidences. They are part of a carefully constructed visual language that rewards repeat viewing and careful attention. The trauma processing that happens in Season 2 extends not just to Mark and Debbie, but to essentially every character who is in some way connected to what happened at the end of Season 1. The show understands that trauma is not a singular event but a process, and that different people move through that process at very different rates and in very different ways. Some characters cope by throwing themselves into action. Some withdraw. Some become harder and more closed off. Some reach out desperately for connection. The variety of responses feels true to life in a way that is relatively rare in genre storytelling, where the tendency is usually to have characters process trauma quickly and then get back to the main plot. Now I want to take a moment to appreciate the music of Season 2, because it is doing extraordinary work and deserves more attention than it typically gets. The score for Invincible has always been interesting, but Season 2 introduces some new sonic textures that perfectly complement the more psychologically complex tone of the season. There are moments where the music does something almost unsettling, where it sits in a register that is neither triumphant nor tragic but something in between, something that leaves you feeling uncertain in exactly the way the narrative wants you to feel uncertain. That kind of precision in musical storytelling is not easy to achieve, and the composers deserve enormous credit for it. Something that is worth noting about the production of the show is the way it manages its most intense scenes. Because Invincible deals with extremely graphic violence, the creative team has had to think carefully about when to deploy that graphicness and when to pull back. The violence in the show is never gratuitous in the sense of being there purely for shock value. It always has emotional and narrative purpose. But the team also understands that you cannot maintain shock as a consistent baseline. If everything is equally intense all the time, nothing feels intense. So they are very strategic about building and releasing tension, about letting episodes breathe so that when the violence comes it still has the power to land with full force. Let us circle back to Nolan for a moment, because even though he is largely absent from Season 2 in a physical sense, his presence is felt constantly. The writers do something really smart with this, which is to make Nolan's absence itself a kind of presence. Every time Mark is struggling, every time the emotional weight of what has happened becomes too much, Nolan is right there not as a character in the scene, but as a gravitational force shaping everything around him. The decision to structure the season this way, to let the most powerful character in the show's recent history be felt rather than seen for much of the runtime, is a brave one, and it works beautifully. Here is something interesting about how the show approaches morality that I think distinguishes it from most superhero content. Invincible does not have a simple moral framework. It does not tell you who the good guys and bad guys are and then ask you to root for the good guys. Instead, it presents a world in which almost every significant character has done something that is genuinely questionable and then asks you to hold that complexity without resolving it. That is uncomfortable for an audience that is used to moral clarity from their superhero stories, but it is also much more honest about how actual human beings and their choices actually work. The animation of facial expressions in Season 2 is something that I think gets underappreciated. So much of what makes the show work emotionally is communicated through very subtle shifts in expression, the micromovements of features that convey internal states that the dialogue does not fully articulate. The animators clearly studied human emotional expression in enormous detail, and the result is characters whose faces feel genuinely alive and psychologically inhabited rather than just being vessels for moving the plot forward. When Mark looks scared, it is a very specific kind of scared that tells you something about the nature of his fear, not just that he is afraid. The show's handling of its romantic relationships in Season 2 is also worth examining. The Mark and Amber dynamic reaches a really honest and somewhat painful moment this season, and the show handles the end of their relationship without villainizing either character. Both of them are doing the best they can with genuinely difficult circumstances. Both of them make choices that are understandable even when those choices hurt the other person. The willingness to let a relationship end without declaring anyone the bad guy is mature storytelling, and it models something important about how relationships actually work in the real world. Now here is a genuinely fascinating production fact. The team behind Invincible has access to Robert Kirkman, the creator of the original comic, in a way that many adaptation teams do not have access to the source material's creator. Kirkman has been involved in the production of the animated series in a very hands-on way, and this has allowed the show to develop in directions that diverge from the comics when dramatically appropriate, with the blessing and guidance of the person who created these characters. That level of creative continuity between source material and adaptation is rare, and it shows in the confidence with which the show makes choices that the comics did not make. The Season 2 finale deserves its own discussion because it does something structurally interesting that most finales do not attempt. Rather than resolving the season's central conflicts in a way that provides clean closure, it instead positions the viewer at the threshold of something even larger and more complex that is coming. This is not the same as leaving things unresolved for the sake of it. The emotional arcs of the season do reach meaningful stopping points, but the larger narrative continues to unfold, and the finale is very deliberate about making you feel the vastness of what is still ahead rather than the satisfaction of what has been completed. That is a bold choice that trusts the audience to tolerate ambiguity, and audiences who have been paying attention fully deserve that trust. Something I want to highlight because it genuinely moved me when I noticed it is the way Season 2 treats hope. Despite everything, despite the violence and the betrayal and the ongoing existential threats, the show has this persistent undercurrent of hope. Not naive hope, not the kind of hope that ignores how terrible things can be, but a harder one kind that persists precisely because the characters have seen how bad things can get and are still choosing to fight for something better. That is the kind of hope that actually means something, and it is what keeps Invincible from becoming nihilistic despite dealing with genuinely nihilistic subject matter in several of its storylines. The dimensional travel mechanics in Season 2 also worth a moment of appreciation from a world-building perspective. The show does not just use the multiverse as a backdrop. It thinks through the logical and emotional implications of what it would mean to be able to move between realities. What would it mean for your sense of identity? What would it mean for your relationships? If there are infinite versions of the people you love, what does that do to the specific love you have for the specific version of them that you know? These are not questions the show answers definitively, but it asks them in ways that stick with you. Let us appreciate for a moment how Season 2 manages its ensemble. This is a show with an enormous cast of characters, many of whom have their own complex storylines and emotional arcs. Keeping all of those plates spinning without any of them feeling neglected or perfunctory is a genuine organizational challenge, and Season 2 handles it with remarkable grace. Part of how they do this is by understanding which characters to put in the same orbit at any given time so that their stories can develop in ways that illuminate each other. Cecil and Debbie, for example, occupy very different emotional registers, but putting them in proximity to each other creates a kind of dialogue between their worldviews that enriches both of their storylines. The way the show depicts government and institutional power in Season 2 is also really interesting. The Global Defense Agency and the way it operates raises all kinds of questions about accountability, about who gets to make decisions that affect everyone, about the difference between authority granted by institutions and authority earned through genuine service. These are not abstract political questions in the context of the show. They play out through the lived experiences of characters we care about, which makes them feel urgent and personal rather than theoretical. Here is one more thing that I find endlessly compelling about Season 2, and it is maybe the thing that stays with me the most. The show is deeply invested in the question of what we owe each other. What do parents owe their children? What do children owe their parents? What do heroes owe the people they protect? What do those people owe the heroes who sacrifice for them? There are no easy answers, and the show does not try to provide them. Instead, it keeps returning to the question from different angles, through different characters, and lets the weight of it accumulate over time. By the time the season ends, you have been sitting with that question for hours, and it has gotten under your skin in a way that the most spectacular action sequences never quite manage. So as you let all of this drift through your mind tonight, think about the layers that are working in a show like this. Think about the color palettes and the sound design, the careful psychology of characters dealing with trauma in real and honest ways, the philosophical weight of the multiverse storyline, the way a show about superheroes can be a genuinely grown-up exploration of identity, legacy, and what it costs to choose to be good. The craft that goes into something like Season 2 of Invincible is extraordinary, and it is the kind of thing that rewards not just watching but thinking. So let it settle. Let the images and ideas move through your mind as you rest tonight. Sometimes the best appreciation for something beautiful is just letting it be there with you quietly. Sleep well.